Welcome to Use and Integration of Interpreters with Victims of Human Trafficking, co-sponsored by the ABA Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence and the ABA Center for Professional Development. Moderating the program today is Michelle Duarte. Michelle is a program coordinator at the ABA, Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence in Washington, D.C. Michelle, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Joining me on the program today is Vivian Huelgo, Chief Counsel of the Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence here at the ABA, and Modi-Khant, Executive Director at the Georgia Asylum and Immigration Network, also known as GAIN. I'll turn it over now to Vivian Huelgo.
Thanks, Michelle. This is Vivian Huelgo from the ABA Commission. Before we begin the presentation, we'd like to encourage all of you who are joining us to please ask questions using the Q&A box previously described. We will try to incorporate and address all questions as we move throughout the webinar. We'll also be displaying our website page at the end so that you can submit additional questions for us for technical assistance and support through our website. But again, please ask us questions throughout and we'll try our best to incorporate them, and we'll also set aside some time at the end for questions. This is the final webinar in our webinar series for the Survivor Reentry Project called Post-Conviction Advocacy for Survivors of Trafficking. You can still see earlier versions or earlier webinars on our website. Again, that's www.ambar.org/CDSV, and we'll display that website at the end of the webinar. But the topics for the earlier webinars included, first, a basic criminal justice system overview. Second, impact of arrest and conviction records. Third, bringing a vacatur motion. 4, best practices for working with survivors of trafficking in vacatur cases. And finally, vacatur and immigration. For today, we hope that as a result of participating in this webinar, you will be better able to assess when you need an interpreter to effectively communicate with your clients who are survivors of human trafficking. List and think about and consider the types of interactions between attorneys and clients or advocates and clients who are victims of human trafficking in which interpretation is necessary. And then deal with and respond appropriately to barriers to client communication and trust building by properly utilizing an interpretation service. And finally, we hope you'll be better able to identify the steps that are necessary to create an effective language policy at your organization. So now we're going to do a little bit of a poll. Thanks, Michelle, for bringing up the poll. And we'd like to know a little bit more about all of you. We can see that many of you have logged in. We have several participants. But could you just let us know if you are a public defender, a criminal defense attorney, a civil legal services attorney, if you're a volunteer attorney and you do pro bono work? Are you an advocate who is a social worker? Are you a prosecutor, a district attorney, a prosecuting attorney? Are you some kind of a judicial officer or a judge, or do you work with within a courthouse setting? Or are you some other kind of law enforcement? And that'll just give us a sense of who is on the webinar today. So I see that folks are identifying, voting. If you would just click away further, we'll keep the survey open a second more. There you go. And I hope you've made it public. If not, I'll just share with you that we have some mainly social workers and then a variety of law enforcement, judicial, judges, courts, prosecutor, as well as other kinds of defense attorneys or public defenders, as well as a civil legal services attorney. So we have quite a variety across the board. Obviously, all of you are professionals who are working and interacting with different legal systems and obviously have some connection to working with or serving survivors of human trafficking. So thanks for joining us for this final webinar in our webinar series on the appropriate use of interpreters in serving trafficking survivors. And I'll now turn it over to Monica.
Thank you so much, Vivian. And I'm really grateful to do this webinar with you. Vivian and I have trained together at other interpreter conferences, and one memorable one that the ABA put on a few years ago. And it really, for me, doing this work, at that time, I've probably been doing this work for 16 years. Now I'm close to 20 years of working with, clients who speak different languages. All our clients at GAIN, which is where I work, are immigrants. Initial training that I had really was eye-opening for me, someone who had done this work for a very long time, and it caused me to reevaluate how we did things in our organization with regards to interpreters and our clients, and I really came back, a little bit changed, a little bit scared that we hadn't been doing things that I hadn't thought of before, but it really is a good recheck on, how to properly provide interpreter services and things we may take for granted when working with clients that we really should look a little bit deeper into. I wanted to take a second to maybe just talk a little bit about GAIN to give you a little bit of context and history of the work that I do with GAIN. I'm the executive director, and GAIN is a nonprofit, the Georgia Asylum and Immigration Network. We're a nonprofit in Atlanta, Georgia, and we represent victims of crime and persecution. All of our clients are immigrants, like I mentioned, and so I would say 80% of our clients have a need for interpretive services right from the beginning. And, that is something that from, the beginning, from the telephonic intake that we have to take into consideration when we're working with a client that just calls us. It's pretty easy when you're on the phone to know whether or not someone needs an interpreter initially. But, when I say easy, when you kind of peel back the onion a little bit, you really will realize what kind of services they require a little bit more, the more in depth that you get into the case. So our first interaction usually with a client is when they call in, and we do an intake over the phone with them, and that's usually done by our legal assistant. And so while I, as executive director, may be a little bit more sensitive to interpretive issues, that also has to carry on to the first person whom the client meets, because that really can set the stage and can set the way the case progresses with that first interaction with the client. And so our legal assistant is the first one who speaks with the clients and has to really flag early on any interpretive needs. What language does the client speak? Are they comfortable in that language? Are there any other languages that the client speaks as well? And that's something that we take really seriously right from the beginning. Vivian, how about you when you've done these cases as well?
Thanks, Monica. Yeah, in my direct contact with survivors, whether it was originally as a prosecutor in New York City or as a civil legal services attorney also in New York City, I really thought, oh, well, I kind of have this because I'm a bilingual person. I'll just talk to the witnesses and the clients directly. And it was really after years of practicing and, as you mentioned, in doing some of this training work together and assessing language access policies and in assessing how organizations really think through and plan for their interpreter needs, that I realized that there was so much more to it to really make sure that we weren't taking shortcuts and that we were thinking about interpreter needs ahead of time before the person walks in the door, and we have a barrier to building client trust and to communicating with our clients. So I realized that it was really about planning ahead and really thinking through how as an agency and how as an organization we were going to not only meet our legal requirements, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, but also really think about how to provide the most effective representation possible to make sure that we have full access to the information that our clients are trying to convey to us. And so, I think that you're right, that kind of first and front line, really thinking about when people either physically walk through the door of your organization or courthouse or whatever it might be, your office, but also that first communication, which is so often the intake system at many organizations. And that might be, for the folks on the webinar who are in a courthouse setting, it might be a clerk's office where you file something. It might be an intake setting, like you mentioned, Monica, that is by phone, or when people are first connecting with a volunteer attorney. You really want to think about how is that set up in such a way that you can quickly access the interpreter services that you need for the variety of clients that might be contacting you.
And that really, that assessment is so crucial, when you first have a client walk through the door, and especially with human trafficking victims. Most of our human trafficking victims that we've represented here at GAIN have faced so much trauma, and when you're doing the assessment when they first walk in, and during the pendency of the case, when you're going to have to talk about all these difficult, horrible, events that have happened in their life during, the human trafficking event, that can be really tough. And so the goal is really to make the client the most comfortable in relaying that information so that you, as the advocate, the attorney, the clerk, in whichever capacity you're working with the client, you can get the most accurate, up-to-date, relevant information that you need in order to advocate best for your client. And, when a client, walks in, English may not, they may know a little bit of English, and, English could be their second language, and they may be able to offer some information to you in that language. But if it's limited, you're only going to get a little, picture of what really went on during their case. The client may, want to, please you and try to get whatever, explain whatever they can, in their, case. But we shouldn't put the client in a position to advocate for themselves in a language that is not their first. I mean, I put myself in shoes, and, if you travel to a different country and if you have to explain, something horrible that's happened. What if you've been robbed? What if you've been mugged? To try to do that in a language that is not first in your mind is really a difficult situation, and that's really how you have to take it when the client walks through the door. The client also, we work with a lot of pro bono attorneys here in Atlanta where we place a lot of our cases. So our client may say, I'll try to, tell, what happened to me in English, because they already realize that the attorneys are doing their case volunteer for free. And so they may not want to put an additional burden on the attorney. And those are things that we at GAIN flag, because we understand that, if you cannot understand the full picture of the client, then you're not going to be able to advocate the best way possible for your client's needs and what they need also. Additionally, when a client is able to speak in their own voice, in their own language, they're also taking some, steps to owning what happened to them, but also, being that survivor and, having a voice in their own case because they're able to speak. Also, finally, we've also had clients. We just had a client that, had a very difficult situation that walked in who had a 4th grade education. And while she may be able to speak in English because she's lived in this country for a very long time, her writing and, just reading, is of the, 4th grade level. So that's also something else to look out for and to look deeper into once a client walks through the door.
I mean, I think, Monica, if I could just jump in with English-speaking clients, it's so easy for us to kind of go with the quicker way of doing things, which is just to talk to them. But I think we're really honing in on 2 things, which is like accuracy and the level of detail, right? So if we use an interpreter in the native language, we're getting to a deeper level of accuracy, and especially when we talk about or think about vacatur motions where we might have to be persuasive in terms of really connecting prior convictions to a trafficking exploitation and experience. You want to get to that level of detail that may be persuasive in a particular state. You may have to convince a judge or a judicial officer or prosecutor to sign off on the vacatur, right? So you really want to get to that level of accuracy and detail. And so, yes, you might be able to set up an appointment or a meeting time with your client in English, but to get to that level of detail, you should consider strongly using an interpreter.
Yes, absolutely right, Vivian, and thank you. And the one thing I'd like to add to that is, we've also had many clients that come in who speak an indigenous language, and, for example, Spanish may be their second language, but it's the more common language. So, I'll take Guatemala, for example. There are many Mayan indigenous languages spoken there, And that really is the language that they're most comfortable speaking because that's what they were born and raised to speak with. And when we try to force that client to speak in Spanish, which might be a comfortable language but may not be their first, as Vivian said, the accuracy is missing. So that's also another problem that I wanted to, a potential challenge that I wanted to raise as well. So as an attorney, you have a responsibility to make sure that the client understands your role, their role in the case, and just the entire case. Any charges that are being raised, any answers that they have to give, that is really important for the client to understand. And if they do not understand that, that is an insurmountable problem that you will have to overcome throughout the rest of the case. It can affect the entire case. The worst case scenario is you never want a client to not understand what they are pleading to or the impact of a conviction. And so, if you don't have an interpreter, then it really can impact all of these points that are raised on this PowerPoint. You cannot effectively communicate with your client. They may not understand the facts of the case. And, the client may not understand why you may be advising a certain way, or why, you've come to this certain result and they didn't have a chance to follow you to get there. In the immigration world, I know that we're talking about vacatures, but in the immigration world, we've filed many motions to reopen on cases just because of the language issue and the client not understanding what they were pleading to. If you want to protect yourself as the attorney and you want to protect the client, you have to have that transparency in the case, and interpretation is very important. As a side note, what one tip I'd like to offer is just to make sure, that the client is understanding even with the help of an interpreter. You just want to make sure that, you ask some questions of the client to make sure that, the process and the questions that are being asked is actually understood. Again, working with immigrant clients, our clients, may nod their head, act like they understand, but then when you ask what was said, I may ask a client, did you understand what the interpreter said, or did you understand what I'm saying? And the client nods their head. But if I ask a follow-up question, well, tell me what that was, do you agree with me? And then they're not understanding, that's when you have to reevaluate what's going on over there. Vivian, did you want to add anything?
I would just say I think that's a really valuable tip, and we're going to be talking a little bit later about, it's so important to really observe what's going on, the interactions between the interpreter and the client. There's obviously a lot you can do to make sure that this is set up correctly, and we'll talk more about that. But I think that was a really valuable tip in terms of asking questions that will require the client to tell you back, right? Like what they understand something to be, just to kind of test and ensure that the interpretation is going well. I think that's a really valuable tip.
Yeah, it's something that we have to constantly check in on throughout the whole case. Just because an interpreter is there, you don't want to be comfortable in that and just hope that the interpreter is interpreting everything that you want the interpreter to interpret. But there is more to that to come. One thing that, is in a lot of courtrooms and a lot of law enforcement agencies is this language card. And it really, it's a quick reference card that helps, with common key questions in, case situations when you're in court and you want to point to something and show, is that what you are, is that what the client is answering to, and it helps. It's a quick reference card. A lot of courts are mandated to have this, and it can assist, our clients in court, with judges, with legal service groups, with prosecutors, with defense attorneys. But one thing I'd like to point out is not all languages are covered. It really is just a quick reference guide. We use it as a starting point, but if you start working with the client and realize that you need more in-depth interpretive services, you have to go beyond that card and make sure that you request that and bring that, to the case situation to make sure that the client has the value of having the right information and that you're not relying on the card. However, the card is a really good first step in getting commonly asked questions, assisted and answered when working with a client. So what do you do when a client, they're either in your office, they're either in court? What do you do when a client refuses to use an interpreter? And that's happened to me a few times where, I am, speaking with a client, I realize, oh my gosh, they really do need an interpreter, let's find that. Or, what if, you try to find an interpreter and it might take a long time through phone services, there's not one ready. What do you do when you don't, when a client indicates that they don't want one? Do you move forward with the case? My answer to you would be no. You really want to protect the case. You want to protect the integrity of the case and make sure that you have whatever interpretive services that you need. I, use these two ways to, talk to my clients and explain, why they should have why I advocate that they should have an interpreter. And the first thing that I say to my clients is, I understand maybe speaking a little bit, and you might be getting, the gist of the case when we're in front of a judge or when we're even speaking. But the positive aspect of having the interpreter is that you get to hear the questions twice. If you get to hear it in English and then you get to hear it in your own language. And it really allows you that time to be thoughtful in your response, or it may clear up any questions that you may have. So when I explain to my clients that way, they kind of get the importance and they understand the importance of having an interpreter there. I also explain, because working with immigrant clients, they may not realize the impact of not understanding of what that can bring to the end of the case. So I really explain that it is in your best interest to understand and to have an interpreter, because it could negatively affect the outcome of your case if you don't understand what is being said to you. And when I talk about the outcome of the case or worst case scenario, then my clients, that usually is the buying argument for them, and they usually are willing to take, an interpreter. Sometimes, having an interpreter can take longer, and so clients are resistant to that. They may have, their child waiting at a babysitter, and having an interpreter, if they can just, kind of muddle through it, might be a better option for them. But you really want to protect your case and the integrity of what your client is saying and the accuracy, like Vivian said. So once I've explained that to my client, refusals, are usually taken care of. Have you had that happen to you, Vivian?
Definitely. I mean, I'd love to hear from participants if they've had that experience and they want to kind of write about that in the Q&A box. They can do that to let us know how they've handled this situation. But I go back to the last thing that you mentioned, Monica, which is accuracy, details. We want to make sure that everything is very accurate. And I sometimes also talk about the other systemic decision makers. It might be a judge, it might be a prosecutor, it might be law enforcement, and I kind of say, well, they're going to also want to know that what we are presenting is is very accurate and is very detailed, and the interpreter will help me, the attorney, in making sure that I have a good understanding of everything. I sometimes may allow an initial conversation to take place without an interpreter and then focus kind of my persuasive efforts with the client for a second or follow-up interview or meeting if I feel like stopping an initial interview or discussion is just going to be a little bit detrimental to the client bonding and client trust experience. And I allow that first conversation to take place and reserve my efforts for ensuring that we have an interpreter for maybe a next interview that involves more of drafting, and then I make that connection to accuracy and detail and how important it is. But if any participants want to kind of share how they wrestle with these issues, I would welcome that in the Q&A box.
Right, and trust building is huge, like you mentioned, Vivian, because a lot of times clients may just want to connect with you one-on-one, and on the fly having to come up with a plan B and saying, okay, this first meeting, that's fine, we'll meet without, but the next one, that's when I'll save the more detailed questions with the help of an interpreter. At least you're building a foundation with the client so that when you do need to have an interpreter, it is a little bit, they're more understanding of it and open to it. And there are many reasons, why a client, may not want to use an interpreter. Perhaps, especially with a trafficking victim, they have, a fear of shame, a fear, they're worried that more people may find out about their case. They want to, they want it to be more private. So having an interpreter there is another person. We see this a lot is clients just not wanting to be a burden. And I know I mentioned that before, but I was surprised with how much we saw that at GAIN, where a client would just try to, say, it's okay, we don't need an interpreter, I can tell you, and, they just didn't want to create more of a problem for, the attorneys. So there are many, reasons.
Yeah, Monica, I think that's a huge one. I know that we mentioned it earlier, but where there is free services being provided, whether it's through a volunteer attorney or through an organization, survivors so often do not want to add expense, do not want to add time. And like you said, sometimes it's because they have limited time. They might have to go to an appointment, or they might have to go to work, or they have to pick up their children. But it also is just about this sense of you're already providing me with this assistance. You're already providing me with all of this other assistance potentially, and now I'm also adding to what you have to do, and that you have to bring in this interpreter. I think when you frame the interpreter as being part of what we routinely and constantly do in many other cases, and we bring in this interpreter all the time, and we have these interpreter services as part of the work that we do on a regular and routine basis, and you just make it that the interpreter is part of the work that is being done, then that helps to kind of address some of that concern. And that's a real, I think, concern that clients are really hesitant to share and address.
And that's a really great way to respond to their concerns, because if you have it routine as part of what you do on a daily basis, then that will be normalized for the client, and they won't think it's that added additional thing that they're causing you to have to do for them. And, right. We see that all the time in legal services. So I think that's a really great way to respond to a client's concern. And we've also had clients that come to us, with their children interpreting for them, or with friends or family. And, especially with trafficking cases, you have to, with any kind of, cases that involve, abuse or torture or victimization, you really want to be careful, because you know that if there's a family member or friend in the room, then the client may not be open to tell you everything that's gone on. I've had clients that walk in, the first meeting, and we tell, whoever is bringing them that we may want, some time alone. We try to set that expectation from the beginning. If we know that a friend or a community member is driving them to the appointment and that we need to take over the, interview with the client, we always try to set those expectations that it's going to be about 1 to 2 hours. It's an initial meeting. We may ask you to sit outside. There's a food court across, in the building across the street. You can hang out there. But sometimes we've had clients resist. They want that friend or family member there. So especially for the first meeting, so that's not when we ask those really difficult questions. We save them for another time, and then we say, okay, if this friend or family member is going to bring you next time, how about we just, use a different interpreter, either through the phone, which also has some challenges, but also, we can have somebody come into the office. And if we set that stage up from the beginning, then it's a lot easier for the second, third, and fourth interview, even though for the first interview, we kind of couldn't let that friend or family member go. Another, time, a lot of times our clients will bring their kids, so we try to have an area, a kid-friendly area in the office where kids can go, because, clients will not talk about, trauma, torture, rape, in front of kids. They probably shouldn't. You don't want kids to have to hear that either. So it's really important to create a separation, for the kids as well. And if a child is there, an older child sometimes, I will be very careful with what I have them interpret. Usually it's nothing more than, I'll see your mother, next week. Just make sure that she knows, Tuesday at 2 o'clock. And that's really, you want to keep it because you don't want that child to also have the burden of having to be that, exact interpreter for their family. That can be a huge burden to bear.
Yeah, I think that's right, Monica. I think that it's not always that on more in-depth trafficking interviews that we have survivors that want to use children as an interpreter, but even for other kind of more routine things like going to court, it can still feel, or like the filing of papers even, it's an important thing that needs to be done, and to use a child in that way is a burden on the child, the pressure of having to be accurate and to know that your family members depending on you for that interpretation.
Right. And so when does a client need an interpreter? And here are a few important probably client interactions and communications where you would want to utilize an interpreter. And looking at this list, it really is probably most, if not all, of your interactions. Of course, the client interview, the initial interview, is so important because that's where you're trust building. That's where you're setting the landscape for the case and really letting the client know, getting information from the client and then letting client know what will be happening from beginning to end in their case. They'll probably have questions. You want to make sure that the client is able to ask you whichever questions they have. Right now, working with immigrant clients, fear of deportation, having a safety plan for them, maybe what will happen to their children is very important. So I want to make sure that the client can ask me those questions, which are top and front in their mind as soon as, we have that initial meeting. Phone calls, regular communication, giving client updates are also very important to make sure that they, can get the accurate information on a daily basis. Documents,
and Monica, with phone calls, right? I sometimes think, well, I'm just confirming that we're going to see each other tomorrow at 10, right? But then, whenever you have communication with the client, there's always a chance that they could ask you a question, which is going to lead to something more substantive, right? So, even when you think you're just confirming date and time, you really want to be prepared to be able to address the question appropriately.
That's
by having an
exactly
interpreter.
right.
Yeah.
Right, that's exactly right. I can probably count on my hand with all the clients that I've, helped, and that I've represented, how many times I was able to just, do a phone call with no follow-up question. There's always, just telling a client, I'll see you tomorrow. There will be a follow-up question, and a client should feel comfortable to do that. You shouldn't create a barrier for a client in not doing that either. Whenever you're preparing for a hearing, most definitely an affidavit. That's where you have the client's story, everything that happened. And if there are missing pieces, it can be really detrimental to their case. In one of my cases, I wrote, I was punched in the leg. Well, when the client had to tell where they were punched, it was really the thigh. And that, little, interpretive issue created a problem for the case because leg versus thigh was something that the judge really harped on, and that was, something that was, interpreted in a different way. Of course, court hearings and finally, withdrawing from a case. Those are really important pieces to any representation, any relationship that you have with a client, and you want to make sure that the client understands everything going on. I said this before, the more the client is involved in the case and the more information they have and the more that they understand, it really leads to the client taking some of the power back, in their case and moving forward and advocating for themselves. So it's not just let's make sure we get everything interpreted right for the client. It is actually a client journey that you're assisting in because the client has more information and power in their case. So I'm going to hand this off to Vivian, who's going to talk through a little bit more about what we've already raised.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. We're going to be talking now a little bit about setup and about how you set up like the optimal situation for working with interpreters on a regular and routine basis and serving your clients or in working with the witnesses that you're working with. And it really, in an ideal world, your entity, whether it is a courthouse, a DA's office, a public defender's office, some other like civil legal services organization, has an established relationship with a provider of interpreter services that can provide some level of screening, qualification, and some attestment to the quality level of the interpreter services that are being provided, and so that you already have a system in place for securing an interpreter, for setting up an interpreter. In other words, you have a plan for meeting with someone, or you know that someone's coming in, or someone just comes in to your agency, and you have a process that you follow for requesting that particular language interpreter. You might even at some point, if you have an ongoing relationship with an interpreter service, have preferred interpreters that you work with who understand and are familiar with all of the legal jargon that you work with, and who are able to work with you to break that down and to not use that jargon and that legalese, but who you have a working relationship with, for example, to ensure that you're being quite clear and direct when you're using the interpreter and communicating with your client. It might be that you are working with a particular community, and that community and that client who comes from that community has a preferred interpreter service that they work with that's affiliated with some agency or organization in your community. That might be the case as well. Of course, we're not going to be using people who are friends or family members, and that would include also maybe advocates from organizations or from a faith-based organization that they're working with. Let's say we really do want to have them work with people who are professionally trained as interpreters as much as possible. There are, of course, lesser used, lesser established, lesser known languages, and sometimes in searching for an interpreter you are using people who are not trained as legal interpreters, people who might have a background, some other kind of a background. I know in some cases they have sought out to use interpreters who are professors of certain languages, and even though they're not interpreters, they're obviously familiar with the language, and those folks are used sometimes. Folks who are affiliated with certain embassies, our consulates are used and have been tracked down to try to address lesser used languages. But really, ideally, you're using interpreters that you have a relationship with in terms of working with them, and they are familiar with your processes at your organization or at your agency or at your courthouse, let's say. You want to facilitate the physical space and make sure that the interpreter has access to a place that is quiet, that is private, where they're able to hear what is being said by you and by the client. You want to make sure that they are visually able to see one another, since so much of our communication is really about like body language and things like that, and you want to make sure that you are able to observe clearly the body language between your client and the interpreter, because again, that's where you are going to see clues that will indicate to you that you are getting an accurate and appropriate interpretation. And obviously culture plays a role here in how people respond in discussing things that are of a private nature, things that are traumatizing experiences, how those are relayed. There's going to be a lot of overlay here in terms of culture, but you really want to make sure that you are watching how the interpreter interacts with with the client, because that's going to be, without speaking the language, where you are going to have some clues to the accuracy of the interpretation. And it's always important, I think, to have kind of a set-up conversation with the interpreter. Again, if this is an interpreter service that your organization is working with frequently on an ongoing basis, a lot of this setup is going to be dealt with because the expectations will have already been discussed in terms of this is how long we're meeting with, this is the kind of client that we're working with. In this case, we're working with trafficking survivors. These are the things we're going to be discussing in terms of courts, law enforcement, prosecution, convictions, criminal records, vacatur, all of the different topics, ensuring that those topics are understood by the interpreter and that there's clarity on what they're going to be then relaying to the client. For example, someone who is qualified as a medical interpreter has a very different kind of background and training over someone who has training as a legal interpreter. And you want to be sure that you are being as clear and as simple and as straightforward in your language to ensure greater, more accurate interpretation. But again, in this setup conversation, preparing the interpreter to understand what the coming interview is going to be about, that's really helpful in terms of setting up the interview for optimal performance by the interpreter. You want to make sure that you have established with the interpreter how you're going to do follow-up. Is that particular interpreter going to be involved in the follow-up communication with the client? Are you planning on using some kind of other service that's available by phone or online to communicate with the client and make sure that the interpreter that is working with you and aiding you in communicating with your client, that they are prepared to kind of convey that information to the client so that the boundaries, so to speak, of where the interpreter service begins and ends are clear for everyone that's involved. And again, you really should be viewing this as the interpreter is someone who is aiding you and you doing your job, in you providing some kind of information if you're in a courthouse, and you providing justice if you are a prosecutor and you're trying to provide those services, and you providing a zealous defense if you're a defender. It is the interpreter who is aiding you in making sure that you can do your job and communicate with the client as effectively and as accurately as possible. And Monica, please feel free to jump in as we talk about the different kind of parts and pieces of setting up the ideal situation for use of an interpreter.
Absolutely. I'd like to just add one thing, to what you said, Vivian. And the only thing I'd like to add is, just remembering that the client is the star of the show, whether it's at your meeting, whether it's in the court, during proceeding. The client really, really is the star of the show. And I noticed many times, just even as a bystander, where, judges or prosecutors will rely on the interpreter and will probably ask the interpreter for additional follow-up without even looking at the client. You really, just even optics, just even looking at the client and hearing the interpreter on the side makes the client's claims and everything that the client is asking for feel legitimate, because I've seen in other cases where, the person asking the questions in whichever role they are, whether it's an advocate, whether it's a judge, like I mentioned, asking the interpreter, but then sticking to the interpreter, and the client kind of fades into the background. Even the way that, even positioning of where the interpreter sits in relation to the client is very important. We take a lot of care in that at GAIN. We try to make sure that the interpreter is behind the client, maybe not in front, because that might impede the way your vision is of the client. We try to have the table setting just in a manner so that the client can remain the key and the key information giver, because it is their case in the whole procedure.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that even just the physical space and setup is really important. I can't emphasize enough how much interpretation is really difficult. It's really challenging. Interpreters have a time frame of about an hour to 2 hours, and not to go further without taking time for a break. So you really want to make sure that the physical space is quiet enough so that they can hear what's happening, so that they can really think and do the simultaneous interpretation. They might also be doing consecutive interpretation, so they might be allowing the client to speak and then the interpreter is interpreting. Some other interpreters do the simultaneous interpretation, which can be harder and for which you really, really want to make sure you have a quiet space because folks are going to be talking simultaneously. Interpreters really have their own way of approaching that, but you want to make sure that you provide a space that is conducive for that, so that it's quiet, so that it's private, and so that they can really, really do that. You also want to do some kind of a test check early on to ensure that there is clarity of communication. I mean, even within the Spanish language, which is a broadly used language across the country in terms of courthouses and other service providers using interpreters, folks from different regions, whether it's the Caribbean versus Mexico versus Central America or South America or Spain. I mean, we all have different regionalisms, accents, different terms for the same things that are used within the Spanish language. And so you really want to be sure that your client is understanding what the interpreter is saying, that the interpreter is conveying what you are saying. I remember having folks, an interpreter from the Caribbean, a client from rural Mexico, and having very serious challenges to clarity, to comprehension. I speak Spanish and I'm bilingual, and I could see that my client was just not understanding, whereas when I spoke to her and when other interpreters had spoken to her, she had a better understanding of what was taking place. And it was really hard to convey to the interpreter that we were going to need to work with someone else. But that's something that you absolutely need to step in and do if it's just not working. Also, we have had cases in which interpreters have been everything from engaging from illegal activity in terms of providing legal advice to being inappropriate and unethical, hitting on clients, being sexually inappropriate, being demeaning, being humiliating to them, refusing to interpret certain types of information. And so it really runs the gamut. And if you don't speak the language, the one way that you're going to be able to see that something is wrong, the one way that you will have a red flag is to be very, very observant, to take your time with the questions, to watch in the beginning of the interview as you're kind of assessing the clarity, how is this moving backward, between all of the parties who are speaking, and really observing how your client is reacting to the interpreter, to the addition of this person, to being a part of this conversation, and are they reacting in such a way that they are readily answering the questions. They might not be enthusiastic and eager, especially as they get into questions that are more difficult to deal with, more description of traumatizing events, but they should not appear fearful of the interpreter. They should not appear uncomfortable with the interpreter, whereas they appear comfortable and ready to speak with you. And I think that those are some of the indicators that you really want to watch out for. I don't know, Monica, if you have had some challenging interpreter experiences that you want to raise and discuss in terms of how we can assess for that and try to address that.
Absolutely. We once had a case with a Korean trafficking victim, and she was at an interview. And first of all, there was a male interpreter there, which, with, the cultural, aspects of the case, that already might have, shifted the dynamics a little bit, and that was something already to watch. But, during the interview, we allowed it to go further a little bit. And, I think for me, what I noticed was the client was shutting down and answering some of the questions, and the responses weren't the responses that I had known her to give after meeting with her several times. And so when we immediately took a break, and when I was talking to her, she said that the way that the interpreter was talking to her was in a really demeaning way. He used the word prostitution when it really should have been trafficking, and those words shut her down and did not make her feel comfortable in sharing the story. And so we immediately had to put a stop to what was going on and check in and have to call, reschedule reschedule and have to call for a different interpreter, we asked for a female hoping that would solve it. But that's not always, something that will solve the problem, male versus female, having someone, of the same sex, interpret. It usually can solve the problem, but not always. I don't want anyone to think that, okay, great, we have, a female interpreter, everything should be fine. You always should be looking out for it. And I think, the biggest indicator, as Vivian suggested, is how your client is responding. What are the nonverbal cues? Is her face suddenly like, white because of the questions that's being asked? And that's something that you have to judge in your role of working with a client.
I mean, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think that's why the kind of setup conversation with the interpreter where you go over, the length of time, basics, but also what is this conversation going to be about? What is this client case about? And really reading their response as an interpreter. So, I'm about, to talk to someone who is a survivor of human trafficking, and, this is what we're going to cover. And are you comfortable with that? Have you worked with trafficking? Have you interpreted for trafficking survivors before? Like, really read them. Because in the sense of if they respond to you in a way that is uncomfortable, judgmental, then it's not going to be an effective interpretation for you. Like that's not an interpreter that you may want to use. You may get questions from them as interpreters. That should be clarifying questions, but if it's questions that go to some kind of a fascination, with let's say the sexual exploitation that took place, then that's not going to be an interpreter that may be appropriate for this kind of a case. And so having that conversation outside the presence of the client and before you get started is important. And it's also why in an ideal setting, your entity, whatever it might be, will have a relationship with an interpreter service. And so you can have some of these ongoing, policies. Who are the clients that we work with? What are the cases that we're working on? Or who are the witnesses that we're working with? What are the kinds of cases that we're working on to make sure that all of the interpreters that come from that interpreter service are fully prepared to deal with these sensitive topics. So that's really important. And we just had a question or a comment that came in that it's important to note to take breaks. That's absolutely true. Whether you are working in office or in a courthouse setting, it's really important to take breaks. Interpreter fatigue can happen as early as 30 minutes into a session. That's absolutely true. I have often argued with either opposing counsel or judges or others that we take hour breaks. That seems to be the optimal amount of time in terms of being able to get work done that's necessary in order to work with the victim, witness, or client, and not to go beyond a 2-hour mark overall, really just for the client's purposes and for the interpreter's purposes. And yes, interpreter fatigue is a very real thing, and especially for interpreters that are working often with different organizations or entities, they're going to want to do their best, but they may feel uncomfortable in protesting and saying, look, I can't go, I can't perform the interpretation service for longer than, an hour, 2 hours, or 3 hours, since they're, working for the organization or for the entity. And so it's going to be up to the attorney who is using the interpreter to both ensure quality interpretation for their client, but to ensure the quality in terms of defending in a way the interpreter needing to take a break or needing to stop or needing to reconvene and come back together at another time. I don't know, Monica, if you have any thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I've often noticed even in just client meetings, we get so deep into the story and, the client is finally, opening up after an hour and a half of, speaking with, her. And then I notice that our interpreter, hasn't had a break and, might, need a little bit of time, might need to, even just something, easy like a bathroom break. That is something that, we need to be mindful of as, the attorneys and, the ones who really can see what's going on in all aspects of, the room, with every participant in the room. And so we've had to, for the interpreter, even slow things down too. So it's really important to be mindful of that as well, making sure that the interpreter has the breaks that they need, for themselves to recharge. And, there was one or two cases where it went on longer, and the interpreter was like, had expressed, I need to stop this. Has gone on for 4 hours, and I'm probably not interpreting the best way that you need me to. And I really was appreciative of the interpreter red flagging that for me as well, and taking that in mind too when working on the case.
I mean, a great interpreter will tell you, I need a break. This is when I need to take a break. A great interpreter will also sometimes carry with them a reference book, a dictionary. That's a sign of a great interpreter who is diligent and cares about their work. So that should not be taken as a sign that maybe they're not a great interpreter. I think that sometimes where there are issues or challenges with interpreters, on the one hand, it might be the interpreter quality, but on the other hand, I think that often it's about us, right? Are we talking too fast? Are we taking too long and requiring the interpreter to interpret for 4 hours or more? Are we asking convoluted questions? Are we asking, using double negatives, right? Like there's all these ways in which we who are using the interpreter actually causing the harm and the challenge to more effective interpretation, right? And so it's on us to have the physical setup, but also the setup of how we're going to approach an interview or a conversation, that it all be set up in the ideal and best way possible, so that then the interpreter can come in and be as effective as possible. And then part of that is to address that interpreter fatigue and to allow them to use whatever tools they need. If they bring in something like a dictionary, that's perfectly appropriate for an interpreter to do. We're going to be talking a little bit now about American Sign Language interpretation, and then we'll come back and kind of look at broader organization and how to ensure that you have great language access policy at your entities. But let's spend a little bit of time talking about American Sign Language. And I know that not all, if there are any participants on the call who have experience using ASL interpreters, we'd love to hear from you. So you can put that comment, like the last comment regarding interpreter fatigue was in the Q&A box. You can feel free to add that comment to the Q&A box. We'd love to know about your experiences using an ASL interpreter. Not every attorney that we've had at our trainings that we offer nationally has had that experience. A couple have, and I think many of them are lawyers who happen to be connected to specific communities. I know that we have, for example, here at Gallaudet University here in DC, and so there is a large population who are accessing different service providers, and so those service providers are very adept at securing ASL interpreters, and so they have experience with that. So it's really important to, I think here, as I said earlier, to have a relationship with an organization that is providing the ASL interpreter. I think that that's really critical. I think it's really important to also know that ASL is American Sign Language. There are foreign sign languages that are different, and so that's going to be something that is going to come up in terms of securing an interpreter service and making sure that you have the appropriate and correct interpreter service on deck and ready for the client situation that presents itself. And there are obviously regulations that apply here, and the Americans with Disabilities Act also applies here. So we know that it is our organizations, our entities that are ensuring that we have access to the ASL interpreter, and not our clients, right? That they are not the ones who are bearing that burden. And we should talk about the different methods of communicating. There are different video relay services, 711 calls, and things like that. But just in thinking about especially the physical setup here is really important, because you do absolutely want to have line of sight between the ASL interpreter and the client. Clients who are working with ASL interpreters may have preferred interpreters that they are working with on an ongoing basis for all of the different kind of systems that they're interacting with, and so it might be even more so than with the previous language interpreters that we were discussing, that there is a preferred interpreter that they're working with, and they bring that preferred interpreter with them. Critically here, I have seen many more ASL interpreters be really firm and clear about the timing for breaks and having 2 interpreters available so that they can trade on and off. And I've seen that take place in both meetings, interviews, presentations, all kinds of things. When working with ASL interpreters, you often see that they work in teams and that they are really much more strict actually in terms of timing than the other interpreters that we were just discussing. And you want to, as we were discussing previously, speak directly to your client, not to the interpreter. You want to speak at a normal pace, as we were discussing earlier, and be as clear and as straightforward as possible. I mean, really with all your clients, we should be avoiding the legal jargon and the legalese unless it has to be used and you're then explaining it, defining it, breaking it down. And again, it's preferable to have one person speaking or signing at a time. And that's just to ensure accuracy and to ensure clarity. And you will also, again, with an ASL interpreter, really want to have this set up kind of pre-conversation. What we're going to be talking about, what the topics are, what the time frame is, if there's any documents you're going to be working with, just to ensure that it's clear between you and the interpreter and that you feel comfortable in using this particular interpreter and in moving forward. Obviously, it's ideal to ask what a client's preferred method of communication is, and you know, there are different technological services that can support you outside of using an ASL interpreter in office. So in terms of follow-up conversations or in terms of setting up a follow-up appointment or letting them know when papers are going to be filed and things like that. And so you can use the 711 call system. It's a free telephone call. And the person who is deaf or hard of hearing can use the TTY system. There's also a video relay service which involves an ASL interpreter and the video relay service operator who is the ASL interpreter and signs with the deaf user and then communicates with the hearing person who is using the video relay service. Ideally, you're going to want to be using these systems perhaps with the ASL interpreter that you're working with to ensure that you feel comfortable using the system before you're communicating in an ongoing way with the client. A certified ESL interpreter, I believe that's something I've previously used the word certified, but they're certified, just so you know, by the National Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf. And that is a resource for all of you, as well as the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf as well. And we have, I'm looking for a website, but we can provide that to you for where you can find a certified deaf interpreter. And a certified deaf interpreter is also going to have extensive knowledge and understanding of deaf culture in addition to the American Sign Language. So they're going to be, I think, also a resource for you in terms of the work that you're doing. And they can be a source of, I think, support and advocacy in terms of having understanding of your client and their community. If anyone has used either the 711 system, the VRS, which is the video relay service system, to communicate with clients, or used an ASL interpreter in client conversations, interviews, or in court, let us know in the comment section. We'd love to hear from you about that. I mean, I think that, like I said, the physical space and the layout in your office, and certainly in any other setting that you go to, is going to be really important for the signing, you know, for line of sight and for making sure that your client can see their sign language interpreter, and to just understand that other folks can see the signs as well, so conversations are not going to be private, so keep that in mind. You do not want to rely on lip reading and passing of notes. That's not something that is reliable or is going to give you a sense that you're getting accurate information, so you really want to refrain from that. And the same rules apply that we discussed earlier in terms of not using family or friends. There are all kinds of risks inherent with that run from safety risks because you don't have the full understanding of the history to also you know, accuracy. You want to just make sure that you're getting accurate information, which you are going to have the reassurance when you have a certified deaf interpreter that you have that accuracy that you don't have when you're using other folks. It is challenging, I think, more so than the other language interpreters that we were discussing, to find low-cost interpreters for folks who are in legal services and are concerned about costs, but not impossible. Again, you want to do some of this research and work to track down interpreter services and interpreter agencies, and to track down interpreters ahead of the emergency need, because a client is standing in your doorway or you have a victim witness who is standing in your office doorway. So ideally, you really want to have those relationships with perhaps a community-based organization, let's say that provides services to persons who are deaf in your community. They might be where you could connect to certified deaf interpreters and interpreters who use ASL. So that's going to be, something that you want to establish before you have that urgent need to work with someone. So now we're just going to have a general conversation about working with interpreters. And again, we've covered, I think, a lot of this information in terms of the setup of the conversation, of the interview. But it's going to be the same as we've already kind of discussed in terms of being sensitive to age and gender. The example that Monica raised in terms of the Korean-speaking trafficking client, not using family members or friends, thinking about privilege and where it may not attach if you're using a non-professional person. So there's all kinds of risks involved with using other folks who are not qualified or certified interpreters, and you want to just be mindful of that. Monica, we have, I think, another comment from Jana, which is a lengthy one, so I'm going to let you take a look at that and then just bring us up to date if you could.
Absolutely. One of our participants, Jana, has shared that in her experience, one of her biggest challenges with providing sign language interpreters in specifically legal settings is that there's a very limited number of interpreters who have the preferred SCL credential, which is an expertise in the legal setting, which is very true. And it's also exacerbated by the fact that the RID, which is the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, has a moratorium on issuing more of those credentials. So, that, is an issue that, she has seen as well with working with the deaf population. And also another common challenge is the lack of understanding of the role of a certified deaf interpreter, and the fact that it could be different from a sign language interpreter who has more general credentials, like the NIC, the CI, or the CT from RID, and those are, licensures of credentials. And another common challenge that also Jana has encountered is the lack of awareness that some deaf people require both types of interpreters, the CDI and an ASL interpreter, in order to communicate meaningfully. CDIs serve as intermediaries between a deaf person and the ASL interpreter. So there is, more interpretation involved in that, and you have to have a specific way of doing it. And the ASL interpreter will then interpret whatever is being said to English. So it's a two-step process, and it's important to realize that a deaf person may need more than just one interpreter to communicate what they're trying to say.
So thank you to Jana. I think that's really, really valuable, and there are a couple of resources I think around the country if folks are specifically interested in getting more information. We can connect folks if they reach out to us at the website and ask for the technical assistance on this piece. But we should mention, I think it's already been mentioned, we should mention again that the website is www.rid.org, which is the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, in terms of securing folks. And like I said, there is a challenge, I think a greater challenge with ASL interpreters and with CDI certified deaf interpreters with accessing them everywhere. They're not as readily available. And we also know that happens with some lesser used languages, that it's going to be a lot harder, and so you might be engaging in using Skype and not necessarily have someone in your office. The other place that we would refer folks when we get questions about language access, about interpreters, about ongoing language access needs is at the Vera Institute of Justice, the Center on Victimization and Safety. They also are very, very helpful and are a great resource across a number of fronts, and we often connect people to them. So if you reach out to us, we'll connect you to them, and again, that's through our website, which we're going to list at the end.
And Vivian, one thing that I'd like to add, and this is taking us a little bit away from working with ASL interpreters, is one of the comments that you made in the earlier slide about, when you have family members, in the room who are interpreting, that confidentiality and privilege is attacked a little bit, and that's something that I wanted to address, because we've seen in human trafficking cases, if there is also a criminal prosecution of the traffickers, that's something that you really want to be mindful of, because in the past we've had social workers who have translated, or interpreted for the client be subpoenaed in order to share what was said in some of these, interviews in order to discredit the human trafficking victim, and also, its defense's way of trying to challenge some of what was being said. So you really, especially in those cases, want to be mindful of the interpreters that are interpreting in the room, and you really want to kind of keep it, as accurate as possible and have the right interpreters there, so you're not relying on family members or community members or others where privilege can, be attacked.
Right. Yeah, that's really critically important. You're really running a risk there. I think as we're moving into kind of broader points in terms of how are you using the interpreter, this really goes back to what I mentioned earlier, which is this is about you being mindful of your setting up for this interview, for using the interpreter, and being mindful of how you are speaking to ensure that you get the most accurate translation, the most accurate interpretation possible. And so you are speaking clearly, you're avoiding acronyms and slang, and all of these things are going to go to you communicating in a way that is most clear for the client, and that is most clear for the interpreter to then interpret for the client. And again, we mentioned this earlier, taking notes, taking pauses, asking to stop, asking to take breaks, using a dictionary. These are signs of an interpreter who's really mindful of the quality of their work. And so, you don't want to be concerned about that. That is not a sign that your interpreter is not doing a good job. I actually think it's quite the opposite, that they're being really mindful of providing the best interpretation possible for you and for the client. And again, how do you monitor interpretation when you don't speak that language? Well, again, it's going to be about the observations that Monica described in her case with the Korean trafficking survivor, and it's going to be about really reading the body language of the client that you've been working with. It's also going to be, as I mentioned earlier, about talking to the interpreter about what is going to come up in the case that you're working on, or in the cases that your particular unit works on, and seeing their response. So if they respond in a professional, comfortable way that this is something that they are going to readily interpret for, then you know that you are in good hands, so to speak. But if they respond, with questions that lead you to suspect that they are not going to be comfortable handling the language or the information that's going to be conveyed, then you know that this is not the right interpreter for this kind of case. And you want to really avoid as much as possible speaking in English in the presence of a client who doesn't speak English. As we mentioned when we started the webinar in the very beginning, some clients are English-speaking clients, but you're using the interpreter for the purpose of being as accurate as possible, as detailed as possible, to then be as persuasive as possible with other entities and other systems. But So in the presence of a client who speaks English, you can talk about when you're meeting again, or when you're all coming, when and where you're going to be meeting again, for example, in English, because the client understands. So for a client who really does not understand English at all, you don't want to do that. That could really destroy some of the trust that you're trying to build with your client. And these are some of the signs that Monica, I think, had raised in terms of appearing withdrawn or holding back. If there's any kind of a disconnect between the verbal responses and the actions of the client as the interpreter is speaking, you want to watch out for that. It's not always the case, but if your client has a few words to say, or actually the opposite, right? If your client has spoken at length and then the interpreter is giving you something very short, you want to clarify that you're not getting a summary. You want to get the interpretation of what was said word for word as much as possible. Not every word is directly able to be interpreted, but you want to be mindful of if there is a large difference in the amount of time and the amount of words that are being used. Right, Monica?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, absolutely. And that happens often. I've had to jump in and say, to the interpreter, I believe the client has said more than you've interpreted to me. Can you, let's ask again, and I've had to be very mindful of that and, look at that as a lawyer, because when you hear a client speaking for a minute and then the response that the interpreter gives is 10 seconds, that some things were lost in translation.
Right. And even with reputable interpreter services, even with court-based interpreters, sometimes you do have interpreters who are not interpreting to the optimal degree and who are doing summary. And that is not what interpretation is, right? You do not want a summary of what was said. You want what was said.
You want exactly what was said. That's exactly right. And there are a lot of policies and regulations that are relied upon when going to a court that may not have an interpreter, or even just for our own sakes, following certain regulations, policies, and standards. Here is a list of them over here, and this list is just for you to go to when you want a little bit more guidance, when you want some more policies on interpretation and when it should be provided. These are standards, regulations, and laws that are here to support you when you're seeking interpreters for your clients. This is what is expected of you, your agency and firm, and it's also expected of courthouses, of law enforcement, when they are working with your client in order to find out more information on the case. One thing to keep in mind, and especially something here that in Georgia we've had to look at, is courts have a large caseload. They need to move their cases along, and so if for the sake of time, they may be able to get out of using an interpreter. These are the policies and regulations that you need to raise as an advocate, as an attorney, to make sure that courtrooms, that judges, that law enforcement, whoever, defense attorneys, whoever it is utilizing in order to provide the best interpretive services for your clients. In Georgia, we've had to do a lot of advocacy, education on behalf of our clients to courthouses, to law enforcement, to let them know that these are policies and regulations that they need to stand behind and that they need to support and utilize when they have someone before them that does not speak English. Even if it means scheduling the case or postponing it or rescheduling it, this is something that we've had to really just kind of stand firm on and dig our heels in, and these standards and regulations are what we use in order to support that.
When we get, Monica, when we get a technical assistance request that is basically like our local police, our local courthouse, or even my own legal services executive director doesn't want to do XYZ in terms of interpreters, this is the first place we turn in terms of research and providing the research to the person that's requesting the technical assistance. And so, this is one place to start in terms of persuading, the powers that be that have control of budgets to ensure that you have access to the interpreters that you need to do the work that you all need to do.
And it's worked many times. You know, when we've had to rely on this, this is actually what works. Many times, you know, some courthouses, especially for us in rural Georgia, they may just not know, you know, that they have to follow these policies. But when we raise it, changes are made and they do follow it. So we haven't had resistance once we've raised it, but you do need to know that you have to raise it. You know, as an organization, you know, there is, you know, in interpretive issues, there's also compliance as an organization that we need to follow as well. So as, you know, a nonprofit, you know, here in Georgia, as a representative, as executive director, I am constantly trying to evaluate our data and make sure that you know, I'm always taking in, okay, how many clients have we come in? How many English speakers do we have, or non-English speakers do we have? And have we been able to appropriately provide the services in the language that they need? It influences, you know, my hiring process of how many, you know, languages we need to represent on staff. But if we don't have it represented on staff, then where can I get these languages? Do I need language line? Do I need to have an access to other, you know, interpretive services like Culture Connect? What is it that I need to fulfill? And if there is something that I am lacking, is there a grant? Is there a way for me to make sure that we can provide that to our clients? So this constant evaluation for us is very important because we want to be compliant in maintaining that we have resources available to the recipient. You know, we're always analyzing our cases, seeing where the gaps are, and making sure that we provide the services in an appropriate way.
And Monica, you raised something that I think was important, which is like this idea of bilingual staff. So I'm a bilingual attorney. I speak Spanish. I grew up speaking Spanish, and so I always thought, well, I'll just talk to all of my clients in Spanish. But you know, you really do want to think about even for bilingual staff, like how are they accessing interpreters to ensure the best possible services and representation to clients. And so you may be able to do an initial interview directly because you speak the client's native language, but you really want to think about, is there some step in the process where the client is going to be interacting with other decision makers, whether it's law enforcement, prosecutor, a judge who's reviewing some kind of a motion or an application. And so if that's the case, then you want to make sure that they are prepared and comfortable in working then with an interpreter, and that you are as well, right? If every interaction I have with my client is just me and the client directly, and then all of a sudden I'm with a third party who requires the use of an interpreter, it's going to be awkward for us if we haven't at least, you know, for myself and the client, engaged in the process of using an interpreter and getting comfortable with that, so that it's not the first time that we're using the interpreter is when we're there and decisions are, you know, important decisions that impact the client are being made. So it's just something to think about, even though having bilingual staff is so important and helpful.
And that's exactly right, because you don't want the first time for your client to use an interpreter to be in a courtroom setting where they, you know, suddenly the courtroom setting is overwhelming and there are other factors at play. There's, you know, a judge, there's, you know, folks listening who are in the, courtroom. I think it's really important to practice that before you actually go. And also another element to that is perhaps if you're the only person that the client is relying on for service and for interpretation, their reliance on you may be a little bit more than they need it to be, and it may not be as objective that you need it to be in certain settings. So at GAIN, you know, what we had to do in order to make sure that our policies were, you know, being used at every level of service is we needed to make sure that we had a written language access policy for the organization, that everyone on staff who would come across a client, even if it were someone, you know, in reception, to our legal assistant, to the attorneys, would know how to follow. It's important to have one in place, but before you do that, you have to determine and track your language needs, the protocols in obtaining that language, but also training your staff to notice when interpretive services are needed, and constantly monitoring and evaluating your language needs. What your population, your client population is one year may really change the next year. We've seen a lot of changes in the clients that walk through the door because of the new administration from last year. So you always have to have mechanisms to monitor and evaluate what you're doing in your own agency and in your own law firm or in your courthouse, because the clients who are coming in, the victims are the ones driving your language needs. So make sure that you always have your finger on the pulse for that, and that everybody knows, whether it's the front clerk just handing out documents or accepting documents, to the prosecutors who are in depth in the case. And a policy, can be something that, takes a long time to develop and to write out, but it is well worth it. We have one for our organization, and I'm so grateful for that we have that. And finally, when you're developing, your policy, make sure you do that, because it can guide your organization, and there are steps in order to do that when coming up with a policy. The first step is determining the language need. Like I mentioned, that can constantly be changing. Train your staff on legal requirements and how to work with interpreters. The legal requirements was on that slide that we showed to you a few slides ago of the policies and regulations. And working with interpreters, we also mentioned that before as well. And number 3, you have to establish systems. Making sure that whoever comes in contact, with a client is going to do it in a concise and consistent manner, from bilingual staff to interpreters to the folks who talk on the telephone to clients. Establish, systems for translation. If you need something translated, a document that's very important to your case, what are you going to do in order to get that translated? Some folks have, legal assistants on staff who do that in their, agency. Is that the best thing to do because of what Vivian said earlier? So it's really important to know which documents are translatable in-house, and when you do need to go outside and, actually get a service to do that, having those scenarios already spoken about is very important, and constantly monitoring and improving. We do that on a daily basis at GAIN. We, we have services that we've historically used, and then, there were a few times where the interpreters were not of the best quality, and our clients were in our office crying. Well, that's something that we are taking note of and making sure that we, don't use that interpreter again, writing down who that interpreter was, and, talking to the agency about it, constantly monitoring and keeping track of what you have going on in interpretation is something that you always have to do.
Thanks, Monica. I think having a policy in place is really going to set you up for the optimal situation when the client or witness walks in the door of your organization or courthouse. We have tried to address comments that came in and questions that came in throughout. If we have not, then we're going to show you our website so that you can follow up for technical assistance. And again, today's webinar was the final in a series of webinars that are available online at www.ambar.org/either CDSV or SRP will take you to where you can get technical assistance and where you can find the previous webinars from this webinar series. A really great resource is this resource from API GBV, and it's available online. It's the resource guide for interpretation services. Another resource provider is the Vera Institute, and we can connect you to them if you reach out to us at this website. Again, it's ambar.org/SRP, and this is where we will provide you with technical assistance and happy to answer any questions that came up that we didn't address. So with this, we conclude today's webinar, Use and Integration of Interpreters with Victims of Human Trafficking. Whether you have experience working with survivors in post-conviction cases or are first-time attorneys or non-attorneys delving into this work, we're happy to support you. Please contact us on our website. We can provide you with materials or other support or resources. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm going to turn it over to Michelle.
Thank you to our presenters Vivian Huelgo and Modi-Khant for sharing their time and expertise on the use of interpreters when working with victims of human trafficking. On behalf of the ABA Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence and the ABA Center for Professional Development, thank you all for joining us today.